So just how likely is a further run on the pound? Well, here to discuss that with me is Philip Booth from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Philip, good morning.
Good morning.
The UBS report states that hung parliament, quantitative easing and the huge deficit could lead to parity with not only the euro but also the dollar. How likely do you think that is?
Well, I think parity with the dollar is extremely unlikely, but currencies will fluctuate for all sorts of reasons. And as your report indicated, sometimes policies can almost push in both directions at the same time. Or if you increase quantitative easing, as has been suggested, that may reduce the level of sterling. On the other hand, if you rein in quantitative easing and people fear recession, that might also have an impact on sterling. And I don't think we should worry too much about the value of the pound, either against the euro or against the dollar. Back in the mid-1980s, the pound almost reached parity with the dollar in 1985. The important thing is to get internal policies right, and that means cutting the deficit rapidly and having a credible policy for cutting the deficit on a continuing basis.
Now, of course, a hung parliament is by no means a certainty, but in the last few days it does seem to be more likely. That in itself would create presumably a fairly destabilising effect, both with what you're talking about, the ability to cut the deficit, and also obviously it would put extra pressure on the pound.
It would, certainly in the short term, and I think people have for some time have been underestimating the likelihood of a hung parliament. The electoral arithmetic just happens to be such that it's very difficult for the Conservatives to win, even if they get quite a big, even if they are the biggest party in terms of share of the vote by quite a distance. Now, in the short term, that will create uncertainty without a doubt, and probably there would either be a working arrangement, probably not a coalition, between the Liberal Democrats and either the Conservatives or the Labour Party. But it's also worth bearing in mind when considering that situation that the difference between the parties going into the election is relatively small. You know, George Osborne was strongly criticised for suggesting some public spending cuts additional public spending cuts over the next year, but they amounted to something like 0.1% of national income. So given that the difference between the parties is quite small, they probably would be able to agree on what is in any case likely to be a timid programme of deficit reduction.
Indeed. So what do you actually think that both Labour and the Conservatives, if either of them got a clear majority, would do something quite similar in that they would certainly cut the deficit in some way or make their programme clear for cutting the deficit, and they would both also have to raise taxes? That presumably would help the markets.
Well, if the Labour Party is returned to government, I'm not sure that we can expect to see the deficit being cut any more quickly than they plan at the moment, which essentially is to halve it in 4 or 5 years. If the Conservative Party comes into government, despite what I've said about the short term, in the long term I think there'll be much more downward pressure on government spending and hopefully ultimately on taxation for the general benefit of the economy and ultimately the level of sterling as well.
So briefly, do you think that the pound would actually rally on a clear Tory majority?
I think it would rally on a clear Tory majority, yes. I mean, the markets hate uncertainty to begin with, and there will always be some uncertainty when there is a hung parliament, despite the similarities in terms of the short-term policies of all the major parties.
Well, Philip, there seems to be plenty of uncertainty at the moment. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.